All right. Hello, everyone. This is a new day for sure. And we really don't know myself, Peter Alexander, and I am very happy to be sitting here with Tim Clissold of course, Mr. China fame, the book that I cannot believe, Tim, is now 20 plus years old.
It is.
And after, I don't know, the better part of a year of trading emails back and forth and I don't know, a couple of Zoom calls here and there, the
Yep.
proverbial pulling of our hair out, decided to sit down and kind of have a conversation about things that are going on in the world vis-a-vis China. And here we are. But Tim, as you sort of noted in the email this morning before we kicked this off, the question came up of why now? I mean, I can, blather on all day long about that, but very keen. I know you've sort of decided over the past better part of a decade to, sit things out as it were, but why the interest right now in sort of getting more involved or starting to, you go down to Hong Kong, start, working in different companies, become a bit more public as it were.
Yeah. So, I felt for years and years, partly because of the mistakes that I made when I went into China, that there's just like a massive knowledge gap between China and the West. And that's not for any particular reason that they're kind of smarter or more brilliant or anything else. It's just because their history forced them to, to study the West and understand it. Um, we haven't really gone through that process. And I just think the knowledge gap between China and the West is so huge. And that is an enormous drag on the West being able to deal effectively with China. So over the last 20 years, that's sort of been mainly, things like commercial disputes, trade, economics and so on. Now it's much deeper because, with the fragmentation of the West, particularly obviously now I'm from the UK. So you've got the EU and the UK is outside the EU, obviously. Um, and we've got some really difficult choices to make about what kind of alignments we have internationally, what kind of society we want to live in and stuff. So the game has completely changed. It's not just about, foreign currency trading and commercial disputes and all that kind of stuff. It's really basic now. And I just really worry that the knowledge gap is so enormous. And the UK in particularly has very scant capacity to deal with China, just because it's never really studied it. So in the whole country last year, there's 321 graduates in China studies. So the China studies includes any degree that has the word China or Chinese in its title. So that even includes like Chinese and French, where 80% of it is French and only 20% Chinese. So there's an enormous knowledge gap, which has now been recognized by, the incoming government. Um, and I just want to kind of get involved in trying to up our game a bit. And as you know, I've been trying to get more China content into the UK education system for the last 15 years. And I think the change in the geopolitical events might mean that that could happen.
No, and again, I think that's the reason, sort of the simpatico, if you will, of the two of us sitting down and having this chat is, you I would say from an American's perspective, there's one thing of saying, "Oh, there's not a lot of understanding," if you will. But the more dangerous element that I've been witnessing, that's gone on, you could call it from the original Trump administration onwards, but it's not just having a lack of information, it's the type of information that is permeating into the various, not just the policy circles, but the way it's sort of trickled down into conversations with everyday people. And
Yeah.
I think one of the more interesting elements is it's gone from, for me, like 0 to 100 in terms of, I don't know, call it 10 years ago. Nobody really cared much about China. I mean, China was out there, China was doing what it was doing, but it wasn't on the covers of magazines, it wasn't being discussed on the nightly news, and it certainly was not a policy priority whatsoever within Washington, DC.
Yeah.
And then, it went from Trump 1.0 to then even with Biden and then Trump 2.0. And, the reason why I think it's very important to have these conversations is to broaden the level of discourse, Because I think as I continue to talk with you and others, I've always said that, the various critiques leveled at China, I think, are 100% accurate. But I also find that the manner in which those are being discussed in the US, you can speak to the UK, but are, as I describe it, woefully incomplete. Yeah, I don't want to go necessarily as far as saying agenda driven, but there does seem to be an element of that.
Yes, if you're gonna try and drive a deal with any counterparty, you have to kind of figure out what is realistically possible for that other party to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's no point just yelling and just yelling and yelling if the counterparty can't do what you're asking it to do. So you've got to kind of, for any deal to stick, you've got to put yourself into the shoes of the counterparty. And I think that's just really, really difficult for most Western policymakers to do because there isn't really this body of information out there. So, I mean, we've discussed this many times, and um, it's not a question of whether you're sort of pro-China or anti-China. You just got to see it for what it is. It doesn't really matter where you are on the scale. We just need to up our game on that because if you think that China's a mortal enemy, then you need to deal with it. I mean, you've got to deal with it as it really is and see where it's strong and where its weaknesses are. If you think it's a nice pink, cuddly panda, then you need to figure out how you can cooperate so that both sides win. And both those things need, much better information, I think, because the tone in the Western press generally is very negative, I think.
Right.
It focuses. I mean, of course, there are all sorts of problems with China. Everybody knows what they are. So the freedom of speech and what's going on in the Western regions. Everybody knows all that. Of course, there are problems there, but there are lots of problems in our society as well. And it's kind of, if you were dealing with some of those problems as a diplomat, how would you approach them? What is it possible for the Chinese to do to alleviate some of the problems that are in Xinjiang and so on? What realistically
Right.
could they do? Rather than just yelling at them and saying it's a genocide. It doesn't get anybody anywhere.
And it's funny because one of my and I've it's one of these hills that I'll die on is I'll hear a lot of people talk about, well, when we're talking about China, we need it's a nuanced conversation. And I'll say China's not a nuanced conversation. It's a different conversation. And when I hear people say that they want to be nuanced when having these conversations, for me, what it seems to come across as is I don't want to actually take a position. I'd rather be able to sort of be on either side and say, yes, but, or yes, but maybe. And I completely agree with the idea that um, when you can make that first important step and say China is different, then it goes to your point of, okay, what does that mean? And how do we then go about trying to adjust our approach to engagement?
Exactly. So it just take the most kind of basic thing, which is the relationship between the individual and the state, which in China is completely different from the one that we have, right? So you could say, oh, well, it's just like, one alternative answer is it's just a small group of wicked men sitting on top of the whole of society, controlling everybody, yeah. Or you can say, well, actually, you know what? Our traditions came from kind of, ancient Greece and so on, when small city states that could kind of manage a democracy and discussion in the market square, and China was kind of came up through the warring states. Yeah, so completely different conditions because the problem is that if you sort of go to the default one, or they just allow themselves to be exploited by these terrible small number of people at the top, then you start thinking, well, actually, the Chinese must be very different, fundamentally different from Westerners as human beings, and I just don't really buy that argument. You've got much more in common. Of course, there are differences, but you need to understand the context of how all this situation arose. Why are they doing these actions that appear to be contrary to kind of accepted ethical norms in the West? There's always a reason.
No, absolutely. And again, I think, in a slight difference of opinion, perhaps, is I've always viewed it from the standpoint of when you have the Europeans and the Americans, particularly, I've always seen this sort of Judean Christian ethos as being the driver. So, consider something like contracts, like you're sitting across from a Chinese counterparty And, like, I'll give you a quick example. You spend as a foreigner an exorbitant amount of time going back and forth, dealing with legal counsel, so on and so forth. You finally get to the point where you sign the contract. And I had a client at one point that had an investment management contract where they were running money for, one of the big Chinese institutions. And 6 months into that relationship, that Chinese institution, called up the foreign counterparty and said, "Hey, we want to reduce the fees in the contract." And the
Yeah.
foreign counterparty got upset, called me, went on and on and on, and I said,
Yeah.
"You
Master Prince.
you know,
Yeah.
this is kind of how the old joke yet not a joke of it's only
Yeah.
you only start negotiating after you sign the contract type of situation." So
But there's
go ahead.
there's a lot in the underlying concept of that, which brings us back to language as well. So, like, in the Chinese contract, party A, yin guy, do whatever it should do. Yin guy means something like should, ought to. It'd be better if you did than you didn't. It doesn't mean like must. Okay, so it's different. So there are all sorts of nuances in the language, and I think that that's a big barrier. So, just the word communist, which is so fundamental to any discussion in China. Say communist. So a Westerner, I think of Stalin's big moustache and, Putin with Novichok in the streets in the UK and all that kind of stuff. And then, how do you reconcile that to all images that are beaming in from China? You can't really. So we need a different word for it, which we should go much further back to the imperial system that's, been there for 2,000 years. And understanding that, and, the bureaucracy and the scholar official and all that and what the party is trying to do in terms of its professionalization, that gives a much better view into what China's trying to do and how it behaves than the word communism.
Yeah, but again, I
So
mean,
it, you almost need a new vocabulary to be able to discuss China.
it's a very good way to put it, which I think then just complicates further the points that we were making at the start, which is if you're unable or quite frankly unwilling to take the time to try and understand a counterparty that is uniquely culturally across the board different,
Yeah,
then you have to get into the aspect of, well, maybe the way in which we've sort of contextualized it also needs to change.
exactly.
And I can't, again, I'd love your perspective on sort of the UK, even Europe if you've got it. But, from the Americans' point of view, I'm a child of the 80s, right? Grew up, most formative years during Ronald Reagan, evil
Yeah,
empire, whatever you want to call it. And watching the sort of playbook from that period of time throughout Washington, D.C. be applied to China, I
yeah,
think is the gravest of real mistakes at this point in
yeah.
time.
Really agree with that because it's just like the conflating of Russia together with China is just that's just so wrong. Because Russia's essentially culturally European. And China obviously isn't. So, going back to this point about language before, it's not just about the language, it's about the sort of real underlying concepts. There are lots of concepts in Western language that you can't really put into Chinese, like say limbo, for instance, the Roman Catholic Church. Yeah, I mean, how do you put that into Chinese? And then how do you put xiao, filial piety into English? You can't without a lot of background knowledge. So my belief is that actually, paradoxically, we have to put language on the side. Because if you go inside Europe, if you go between European languages, you are translating from one culture to the same culture. So most of the concepts in French are the same as they are in English, not the same in Chinese. So we need to start in a much more basic thing. And unfortunately, the education system, certainly in the UK and most of Europe, is very, very focused on language. So I think that what we need to do is rethink that approach because we need to build up a big cadre of people over the next sort of 10 to 20 years who understand China. They've really, if you start with the language, people just think, I'll never be able to do that. How am I ever going to learn those characters? I mean, that was my reaction when I came to Hong Kong. I remember standing on the subway station in Wan Chai, looking at the sign for Wan. I just that can't be a word. That just cannot be a word. So how do you even start? Whereas if you patiently go say, okay, so we need to go back to, you know, warring states period, and then how China was unified, and then bureaucratic empire over 2,000 years. Why did it survive for so long? Yeah, because it's not magical. If you can really understand that, then everything you start thinking, actually, sort of makes a bit more sense now. Yeah.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it that and I think that you and we were I mean, one of our first conversations was the paragraph that you put at the very start of your book, Mr. China,
Mm.
I think was, it's like one of the most important, um, descriptions of being a foreigner in China, because you go on about talking about foreigners coming in, so on and so forth, but at the end, if I recall correctly, talking about wanting to be that, 老中国头, Mr. China,
Yeah, like
and then it says
that's finished though, hasn't it?
right. Well, but the best
Yeah.
part was it's all an illusion.
Yeah.
Right? And I think a lot of it has dissipated for sure, but I do believe, and maybe this is the raging optimist in me is, in the time I've been here, there have been ebbs and flows of foreigners coming into China, and I'm sure you've seen it as well. But interestingly enough, there's always going to be another cadre of foreigners that are going to come in. They're going to go through the various stages of, this is great, but then always running up against that wall, because I'll explain to individuals that the inverse relationship that exists of the longer you are in China, the less you actually know. Like
I agree.
you begin to just say, "Oh, okay, um, once a foreigner, always a foreigner." So I agree with the point of trying to learn the language, taking it one character at a time. I would say that from the UK's point of view, if you've got a couple hundred people that are at least focused, that's better than 0. I would dare to even consider what the number is in the United States, because the shift
It
in
it's
in po
a bit higher. It's a bit higher, but it's declining. It's declining. The UK is very low and flat. US is higher and declining. You have got, excellent thought centers and so on. Well,
right.
until the president dismantles them. But you have got excellent thought centers for China. Um, so yeah, and the UK does as well, and it's sort of underutilized, I think, by policymakers and the government. There are some expertise there, but we need complete reset. You've got 321 graduates in Chinese. Okay, so you got 6,000 graduates in classical civilization, which is great, and that's really important. And obviously, there's always going to be a propensity to study classics rather than Chinese in a European, obviously. But we've got 12,000 vets, right? We've got 36 times more vets than China experts. When our government says it's kind of a national security crisis. That doesn't really make sense. 250,000 sociology, 150,000 lawyers, and so on, and then 300 that's not the right balance. And there's a reason for it, and that's because we try and get people to study the language, and it's too difficult.
Yeah, and it's funny because I'll ask you, I've never asked you the question. I mean, how hard was it, do you think, for yourself when you decided, "Okay, I'm gonna throw myself into the language?" Did
Right.
did you have that moment where you're like, because, like, there's no conjugation of verbs. It's like, "你饿不饿?" It's like, "You hungry, not hungry," kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah. So no,
If you can get beyond the characters.
yeah. So I'm actually terribly nerdy. So I just spent a
Yeah.
whole year, and I just like wrote them out again and again and again and again. There isn't really any other way of doing it. I didn't ever use flashcards. I was more interested in the writing of it, actually, strangely, because there's quite some draftsmanship in it, which I quite like that. Um, but yeah, no. So I did a year at in London. It was actually a course for diplomatic service officers run by the Foreign Office, but I just called them and said, can I join? And they said yes if you hand over your life savings. Yes, so I did. So it's quite a big plunge that was in, and that was literally just after Tiananmen Square as well. So the timing. I remember coming out of. I just resigned my job, and I came out of the office, and the Times newspaper was on a newsstand, and it said, um, "Peaking in flames as China slides towards chaos." Right. So I just thought, what am I doing? But yeah, as we say, the rest is all history.
Oh, no, I it's funny because I took it, as I made it sort of a job to a certain extent, but I made it very efficient. So, when I first got here, I was like, "Okay, I wanna drink a beer." Like, I need to figure out how to say beers to me. And then very quickly had to figure out how to say cold, because every beer I was getting back in the mid-90s was warm. But, it's
Yeah.
funny, I had a bit of a similar situation when I was coming out here where, I was working on Wall Street and didn't that's not what I wanted to do. 92, 93, as you know better than most, China sort of landed on the investment map. So,
Yeah.
applied and received a teaching job, an English teaching job in Shanghai. But I remember every time I would talk to people, I was like, "Yeah, I'm moving to China." And they were like, "Oh, Hong Kong's great. Hong Kong this, Hong Kong that." And I would say, "No, I'm moving to Shanghai." And everyone to the man and woman looked at me like I was out of my mind. They're like, "Oh my, isn't it so dangerous there? Isn't the" and again, it's one of those things, and I think you would agree with this. It's like sometimes it's really good to be young and just didn't really think, you just do it correct. But again, yeah,
I do think it's more difficult for young people now. I mean, partly because if I think back to sort of the '80s and stuff, there were a lot of people who, a lot of foreigners who weren't very good, and they could get excellent jobs here, and that those days are completely gone because the China. I mean, if you want to sort of do hedging strategies or whatever, and you're going to meet Chinese people who know how to do it. They'll all have MBAs from Wharton and everywhere else, which is good.
well, no, and that I think that's the other side of the conversation when you're talking about the need for the UK, Europe, and the Americans to build up a stronger knowledge, a base of individuals that are able to start that process. The
Yeah,
flip side is look at what's going on in China over the last 40 years, right? I think one of the most interesting conversations that we had early on was primary source material, where you talk to a senior Chinese official or even an executive at a large Chinese company, they've read Tom Sawyer in English.
yeah, yeah, Adam Smith and stuff. When
Right.
Bao came over to the camera and he brought theory of moral sentiments with it. So yeah, absolutely, they know far more. Yeah,
And then the joke is always like, well, how many Americans have read like Chinese poets in the language, Lucian, you name it. And I think look, I hands straight up, I have done limited, far fewer primary source materials than I probably should. But
yeah,
it opens the world beyond just the language, because
yeah,
while I think language is vitally important, a bit of a counter argument to that is in my dealings over the years, you'll have people from Hong Kong, Taiwan, American born Chinese, what have you, who technically speak perfect Chinese, perfect Mandarin. But when they've come to the mainland to engage in business, they have predominantly failed miserably,
mm,
because there's that cultural aspect of how you're communicating,
yeah,
regardless of whether you know the language, because it's taking, let's say, the American terminology or the American vocabulary and just literally translating it, so the message itself completely gets missed.
yeah, yeah. No, and it's and it, Americans and Westerns generally, obviously, far more direct. So you know what an American's trying to tell you. It's much more difficult with the Chinese.
Oh, absolutely, and I think that, we were, I think, joking the other day where, there was a headline that came out, this the nonsense of the trade war and whatnot, which again, I think we both agree, all of this is more of a symptomatic to a much larger issue. But,
Yeah,
there was a headline that talked about China was evaluating the possibility or probability of talking with the United States. And as soon as I saw that headline, I rolled my eyes and thought, "Oh God, you know, that just means that okay, let's see what we can do with this." But there's absolutely no commitment whatsoever on the
Right.
Chinese side.
Oh, but even more, so the actual so it's been reported that everywhere, almost unanimously in the Western press, that the reaction of China is, "We will fight you to the end." Right, over the tariffs, right, okay. That's not what they said. The actual statement said, "Feng pei dao di," which means we will match you, normally in a drinking game, respectful drink, we will match you to the end, right? So it's quite different because what it means is it's not adversarial in the same way. And it also means if you lower it, we'll definitely lower it as well. So it doesn't really have an ultimatum in it. It's not challenging in the sense we're going to fight you to the end because as soon as you're right, they're going to fight to the end. We're going to as well. It's not really that flavor. Um, so yeah, look, yeah, lost in translation. That's not a new idea, is it?
God, not at all. But the unfortunate part is it plays to the messaging, which again, I think it brings us back to, why I think it's important that individuals like yourself, me, and there's a few others out there, are able to sort of come out and try to just put your hands up and say, look, we need to take a beat and we need to see what the as we continue to come back to what is the reality of the dynamic right now. And
So the irony is that Trump does have some valid points about
yeah,
a deficit and debt and everything else, right? But just
yeah,
saying, right, we're going to tariff you because you've got to consume more, right? In a country that's had like 25 years of one child policy. So, so parents that, there's just a propensity to save anyway. And then it's been aggravated by the one child policy because Social Security doesn't really work. So people need to rely on children, when they're later on in life and so on. Much more complex than that. There's loads of things that the Chinese could do, loads of things that they could do, and maybe Trump's right by just pulling the whole thing up and creating some sort of crisis out of it, and when the dust all settles and the rubble, you can see where it all lands and so on. There might be something that comes out of it. It's very, very risky, because it's just not going to get. People are just not going to feel they want to cooperate. And the other thing as well about this whole thing is that basically you got the kind of demand shock in China, supply shock in America, which is much more difficult to deal with. But so I was chatting to somebody who's got a manufacturing business up in Dongguan, and now obviously can't sell to the US. Um, so there's some, well, we have got customers in South America. We never really bothered with that because it was just too difficult. So now they're going to go off and develop those customers. That then kind of erodes the American buyers' pricing power. Doing something so abrupt and so kind of in your face just is going to have quite long-term detrimental effects. I think it's sort of but an act of self-harm in a lot of ways.
I look, I have complete agreement with that statement, and it's throughout the past 2 months, if you will, I had this comment where I was talking about, as goes Walmart, so goes America.
Yeah.
Because when you have China that has spent 40 years not just becoming the manufacturing center of the globe, but over the entirety of that 40 years continued to improve upon its, let's call it a moat, the ability to maintain its role. I mean, someone said to me, have you ever asked the question why somewhere like India, which entered the WTO far sooner than China, why India was never able to sort of replicate, the success in manufacturing that we saw in China?
Yeah.
I don't have an answer for it, but I think it's a very important counterfactual
Yeah.
because the arguments I've made to people is originally you had China come in as the low cost producer. That's fine. Okay, we got it. And at the time, back in the 80s, early 90s, the argument made was, well, but they can't scale because again, back
Oh,
then it was all these mom and pop.
yeah, yeah, exactly, yeah. Yeah, and then it's they can't produce to quality, and then now it's they can't innovate. It's all just
Right. But it
it's
gets but again, it's, and I've had, very, animated conversations on this with other Americans where I've said, you know, the first step when you're digging a hole is to stop digging. And to stop digging means you have to look at China and recognize what it is in terms of the overall, global manufacturing ecosystem. And, there are dependencies that are not going to be easy to get through. You're going to have to figure out, are you going to be able to bring certain manufacturing back to your home country? Where else are you going to be able to do it? And I think when you talk about irreparable harm being done, it's for at least me very evident because call it the order of operations, right? Meaning, you have to put gas in the car before you turn on the ignition, or you have to charge it, I guess, these days.
yeah.
As opposed to, we're going to put all of these tariffs on all of these items, but we don't have another source to be able to, acquire those goods that we need for the American economy or the UK or anywhere else.
So say it did work, and then India did take off and stuff, then they're gonna have the same problem with India in, in 10 years' time anyway, so it's not solving the basic problem. And, the other thing, Chinese are just so, agile that, we all know exactly, basically, Trump's just gonna have to tariff everywhere because if there's one place that and it could be like, Kenya or something like that, then there's just your factories will just be there within few months.
Well,
Get
that's
round.
the
Fact I don't see how you can tariff at different levels for different countries because that then affects all capital flows. So it doesn't
the
really
the thing that made me right, the thing that made me laugh was I wanna say the Americans' 2nd largest trade surplus is with Vietnam, and that exploded over the course of 10 years. And again, for one very specific reason, as you highlighted, Chinese manufacturers are nimble, and they moved. I know of a handful of people that
yeah,
didn't move their entire production, capacity to Vietnam, but they hedged their bets.
yeah,
Um,
exactly. Yeah,
and
exactly.
I'm guessing you could see the same thing in Mexico and elsewhere.
Yeah. Yeah, but then, should be looking at what society how it's gonna be organized in 20 years' time. Yeah, so we've already got dark factories in China with no workers. I mean, I haven't been to the port in Shanghai, but I've read that there are no workers there because it's all automated. They're just people to go in and tinker around yeah, well, so I mean, there are dock strikes in the US, right? In China, there aren't any dockers to strike. I mean, so and so it creates enormous challenges for society. Like, what do you do with all the surplus workers? How do you fund, social liabilities, all those kind of things. But just thinking, right, we're going to bring manufacturing back to the States. I just can't see it. I can't see why that's a way forward. Yeah, the issue is the imbalance between the consumption and so on. I get all that, fully get all that, but I can't see how. Well, all those sort of fake, ridiculous AI generated, social media posts. There's a short video clips of Trump and Musk all sort of fiddling around with, sports shoes and stuff, trying to put them together in the factory. But I mean, it's obviously it's meant to be comedic, but there is a grain of truth in it.
Oh,
So
and I think
quite very complicated issues that need really thinking through about where we're going to be in 20 years' time.
totally, totally agree. And again, it's I don't know, an overused euphemism where people talk about, oh, China's got a long-term playbook in the United States. I always talk about low time preference, high time preference.
Yeah.
But, the irony is there's more than a nugget of truth in that. And, here's another example. It's like 吃醋, right? Eat bitterness.
Yeah.
When Xi Jinping makes the comment, everybody's up in arms where, that argument, if you read the Western media was all about, he doesn't care about the households. He doesn't care about the average Chinese, it, you're going to just have to deal with this. Whereas, my, reading of it was, no, it was more of a, hey, we're going through a period of adjustment. We're trying to change the economic model. This is not something that happens overnight. And we all, as a society, need to come together and just,
Yeah.
hunker down and work through it together.
So I think that that raises a lot of issues, that
Okay.
comment. So um, they are long term. That's absolutely right. Oh, they're also totally pragmatic. So if one thing doesn't work, they just dump it. They just, try it and dump it. Doesn't work, and then go on to the next one. Whereas we find that much more difficult to do, partly because of the electoral cycle. So if you try and implement a policy and then it doesn't work, then you get shot down by the opposition. But we are kind of a more axiomatic anyway. I think the Chinese are supremely pragmatic. So can I just do a quick 90-degree turn? Belt and Road. Belt and Road, absolute classic example, right? Where the West sees this as some sort of master plan to dominate the entire world, right? It's actually part of it's a consumption. It's part of all that. They've got far too much capacity to build infrastructure, far too much manufacturing, surrounded by people who love to buy, but they haven't got any money. So
Yeah.
okay, well, so let's try and get you to develop in the same way that we did. Um, so that's and it's just like kind of it's bumbling through, crossing the river by feeling for the stones is the way they always. Yeah, there's no arch strategy. It's just like kind of all the bad debt and all the write-offs, all the corruption that they've had. It's so. Yeah, I don't. It's almost just unavoidable. I mean, Western investment in developing countries highly problematic. Particularly construction, sort of renowned throughout the whole world as being very corrupt and so on. And but Pakistan, which is one of the biggest beneficiaries. There's a guy, I think, on the Senate Defense Committee or something, who just said, basically there isn't any other game in town.
Yeah.
I mean, that was before, but that was before what happened with the US aid and all the other things in the States. So what do you do if you're a developing country and you've got no infrastructure? I mean, Pakistan almost didn't have very very unreliable electricity, let alone anything else. I went there in the 80s and got stuck in ethnic conflicts in the north of Pakistan. It was really scary, and just people shooting at each other, lots of people killed because it's just so there's no real hope there. If you build a road through it, now people can, they've got indigenous industries right up in the north of Pakistan that produces all sorts of different, nuts and fruit and apricots, all that, and then they dry them and there's handmade carpets and there's all sorts of stuff like that. Now there's a train that takes it right down to Gweida port on the south, so you can access. Yeah, so that kind of gives hope to those communities. But it's going to make trade deficit even worse in the developed countries. So it's China's a symptom of something. This is basically all to do with wealth inequalities. Yeah, so
Yeah.
nature abhors a vacuum. So capital is going to go to a place that got lower cost. So it just how do you reverse that? Well, you tariff it. You tariff everything to create an artificial barrier to force capital to go into an unnatural place. But that doesn't. Well, it's never worked before.
Well, I think, just to continue on the thread about the Belt and Road and Pakistan in particular,
Yeah.
one of the
Yep.
interesting elements is how China has, let's call it, provided an alternative to things like the IMF. Because there was a great story where Pakistan was negotiating with the IMF not too long ago, and the demands that were being made by the IMF on the Pakistani government were just, extreme to say the least.
It's
China stepped in and said,
yeah,
"We can help you. We're going to have demands, but they're not going to be anywhere near as draconian."
yeah,
So when you see these news reports that come out talking about how much China has loaned to all of these sort of emerging markets, and basically how horrible uh,
yeah.
the terms have been, so on and so
Oh
forth.
God, yeah, yeah.
I've said, have you seen the terms that the IMF and or World Bank have put on these countries? And in terms of Belt and Road, and I've not really seen this addressed anywhere. China's done two things that I think are fascinating. Number one is, um, it is not too dissimilar to the Dodge and or Marshall Plan after
Yep.
World War II.
Absolutely.
You had the Americans that came in as the benevolent dictators as they were, and they said, "We're gonna help you rebuild under one condition. You have to use our dollars, and the contracts have to use American multinationals."
Yeah.
Full stop.
Yes.
So that's where the first sort of wave of the so-called ugly Americans started to come in.
Yeah.
Um, so,
So
when
there's a reason why China can offer more to a place like Pakistan than the IMF can, because it will get a financial benefit. It'll get a direct financial benefit that is far greater than the loan from the development of that economy, because particularly with its border with Xinjiang. So if trade starts going across there, then that kind of, particularly southern Xinjiang as well, which is where which is the most problematic area. So there are sort of long-term financial and strategic reasons that China can offer a better deal, but I think the strategic ones are much less important. It's not like a big. It's just like a step by step. If we do this, then our construction industry, because we're kind of done with China. We've built enough bridges in China. Oh, let's go and build some in Pakistan. Yeah, but they haven't got any money. Okay, well let's lend them the money, and then so it's not an unusual thing. I mean, France has done that in Africa with Alstrom putting in subways in various countries there. Britain did that with the new airport in Hong Kong. So you use the currency reserves in Hong Kong to get British firms to come build the airport. I mean, it's not rocket science. So it's just like kind of roping forward, but characterizing it as some sort of master plan to ensnare lots of developing countries in a debt trap so that they can then just foreclose on military assets. That's just not getting the point. There's quite a lot of academic work actually on the debt trap, which is really interesting. And Chatham House did a big piece on it as well. Um, and there's not really, I mean, there's that problem in Sri Lanka and stuff, but that was very complicated. It was kind of it was a ridiculous project in the first place that was kind of proposed by the local politicians for their benefit. I mean, that's the other thing it's really important to understand about Belt and Road. The initiation of the project doesn't come from China, it comes from the recipient country. So obviously they're going to say, no, we're not going to do that one. It makes no sense. But the primary impetus comes from the developing country, which then means, it can get very complicated in terms of politics and it's just benefiting one region for the people who are proposing it and all that kind of stuff. But it's just like this fantastic, wild, verging on preposterous idea to just pump $1 trillion into developing countries. Now that can't, generally that's got to be a good thing in terms of leveling up wealth imbalances globally. Because how are we going to deal with migration? How are we going to deal with migration in 20 years' time if people don't have a reason to stay put? Like, say, the middle of Africa, Nigeria's population is going from 250 million to something like 700 million in 50 years' time or something. And it's very vulnerable to climate change. Yeah, if people don't have a reason to stay there, they're just going to get on their boats, and then it's just going to make what's being dealt with in Europe now just look like child's play.
No, and I think ultimately, it can be as simplistic as if the IMF and World Bank had a monopoly on being able to provide loans, that essentially were benefiting, um, multinationals both in Europe and in the United States. That's of course needs to be, positioned in a way where this is China being able to sort of push its way around, and you need to be careful about their ulterior motives.
Oh, so
But what what I found fascinating was, I think it was 2 weeks ago or so, I think it was either the annual or semi-annual meeting of the World Bank and IMF officials in Washington D.C. That's fine.
right. Yeah.
A week later, Xi Jinping makes his first trip down to Shanghai in a handful of years, and one of his key stops was, the AIIB, the Asian, Industrial Infrastructure Bank,
Well, yeah.
BRICS Bank as they call it,
Yeah.
and, this was for me very symbiotic, or symbolic of saying, look, yes, there are these institutions which, if you go back and look at the record, China has worked or has attempted to work within the system to be able to gain a greater share of control
Mm.
over these multilateral organizations. And the United States has completely pushed all of those requests aside. So
So as it is. as their natural importance and significance to the world changes, it means that the original composite, the original kind of configuration of all those structures after the Second World War is being
Yeah,
superseded, and you either have to accommodate a new player or try and keep it out. But if you keep it out, it's going to go off and start playing a different game.
absolutely. And again, I think we're going to see that play out in real time on, this week, May 8th. We've got the VE 7 or 80th anniversary. And, you're going to see headline after headline of Putin and Xi Jinping are meeting. I had to look it up. Xi Jinping was there 10 years ago. He was in Moscow. Long before Ukraine, long before all of these headlines. Um, Meanwhile, 15 or 10 years ago, I think it was Barack Obama was president. I think he went to the UK, big celebration with the European nations. This year, Donald Trump's decided not only is he not going to go, but he's renaming it the Victory of World War II Day. Um, so, that goes to the original conversation that we were just having, the start of, this increasing break between, let's just broadly call it the NATO nations, in a time.
No, I agree with that, and that's tremendously sensitive topic with Russians because 25 million killed or something defeating Nazi Germany. I mean, major contribution to the way that Europe was configured after all that. And it's kind of slightly just, and we kind of have well, we're still sort of flying airplanes down the mall and stuff in the UK to celebrate it. Which is great, and that's all fine, but it was a joint effort.
It was, and I think again, I think you're gonna start seeing airplanes flying across Washington, DC this time as well.
Yeah.
Um, but let me, we're coming up on an hour. I thought
Yep.
to close it out perhaps is what's the solution? Again, I was lovely conversation last night with my wife, and, she said to me, "Look, clearly all of these things are out there. People are being reactionary. Whether Trump says something or does something, it's like, oh, it's one thing to recognize it, but you don't need to necessarily always react to it." And
Yeah.
she said to me something very insightful. Was like, "Okay, Peter, so what's the solution? Like, what are some steps that people should be thinking about?" Now, clearly, one of them is, as you pointed out, focusing on education.
Mm.
I mean, how do we get more people involved in these discussions?
Well, you make it easy for them to do. You make it easier and more interesting, right? So if you think of Chinese history, particularly the 1800s, right? I mean, there's nothing there to just keep like a 16 to 17-year-old student busy for years. Really, so it's an incredible story of struggle and everything else. Yeah. So make it more interesting. But I mean, I just don't think there isn't a short-term solution. The solution is that when a journalist or a politician says something about China, there are enough people who go, "Hang on a minute, that doesn't sound right." So I'll give you a very specific example. There's an article that I read the other day, and it said that you get a life sentence for possession of cannabis in China. Right?
Mhm.
So I'd read probably 3 years ago, I read quite an interesting paper. I think it was based on a white paper by the state council about the way they tackle drugs. So they come down like a ton of bricks on the traders, but they treat the consumers as people who have an illness and need to be cured. Yeah? So I'm thinking that doesn't sound right. So of course, a quick web search and stuff. You don't get a life sentence in China for possession of cannabis. That's just completely wrong. So, so what we need is, sort of body of people, and this will take a long time to generate, but that's ultimately the only solution, mutual understanding, is a body of people who just say, "Oh, that doesn't sound right." When people make
So,
irresponsible and inflammatory statements, yeah, it's the only way out.
so, touching a slight nerve because completely agree. And I have been in more than a few situations where reporters of very established periodicals have called me up about certain topics, mostly dealing with economy, finance, and the like. And
Yeah,
I have spent the time, the energy, to go through and expand upon what it is that is their primary sort of thesis of whatever article they're writing.
Yeah.
For the last 2 years, every single one of these conversations I've had, the points that I have made have not made it into said article.
Yeah.
And, and again, it's the reason why I decide that, I'll go on LinkedIn because, whatever the size of the audience is, there's a degree of therapy for me because I need to get some of this stuff out. But, you do have a certain level of gatekeepers still,
Yeah.
regardless of how social media is expanding. And again, I think it's the reason why being able to sit down and have this conversation between the two of us is vital. Because if nothing else, people will get potentially new perspectives. There is
Yeah.
always the concern about the being in the echo chamber, but
Yeah.
I don't overly worry about that because you don't have people coming out being able to provide the other side of the conversation.
Yeah. That's
So
I think you've hit on a really important point, which is that in the current configuration in Western society, if you say we should be understanding China better, then that is conflated with being a collaborator and it's
yeah,
appeasement, right? So there are politicians in the UK who use precisely those two words, and they're chosen very carefully because it goes back to Nazi Germany again. Okay, so it's all this kind of criminology was a respected statecraft, yeah.
right.
So being passionate about understanding China better is not equated in the same way. So what one thing that I really, really try and push forward in this, it doesn't matter where you are on China, right? It doesn't matter if you're very, very anti and you think it's a mortal threat to Western society and they're just going to destroy us all, or you think we have no option but to cooperate with it for the energy transition and climate change and global wealth inequalities and global health and so on. Doesn't matter where you are on that scale, even if you're at the really negative end, you've got to know more about it because then you'll
Yeah.
see your enemy for what it is, regardless of whether you want to cooperate. So anyway,
Well, listen, as you and I discussed, we have no idea what we're going to do moving forward. I really appreciate that we were able to sit down and have, basically hash this out. We will, we'll play it by ear, and see, maybe in a couple weeks we'll do this again.
absolutely.
All right, Timothy, thank you very much.
Speak soon.